this wave is so big that actually the regular rules of business kind of go out the window a little bit, right? There's really a sense that there's an urgency to act, and maybe we'll clean up along the way.
Hi, everyone, from Max and myself for the latest episode of ABBYY's AI Pulse podcast. When AI stops talking and starts working, our guest today has been building or has been actually helping humans to talk to machines long before LLMs were around. And he's the co-founder and CTO of Rasa, a platform that helps companies build and run AI agents that actually behave the way you want them to. Please welcome Alan Nichol. Alan, maybe you want to briefly introduce yourself.
Yeah, no, that's great. Thanks for inviting me along. And I think it's nicely put, actually behaving the way that they should. Another way we talk about it is that Rasa is for building high-trust AI agents, right? For use cases where it matters that you get things right, you do things the right way for the right reason.
That is awesome, because I think this is exactly spot on what we all want from this kind of technology. So, Alan, this technology has now been around for some years, generative AI, and in people's hands and in business hands. Where do you think it has genuinely moved the needle, and where do you think the story didn't quite hold up?
Oof, difficult question, but because it's such a moving target, because the rate of progress is so dramatic that I think it's well established that sometime around the end of last year, agentic coding, LLM coding went from augmenting what a human could do to the human just looking over and saying, wow, this is doing most of my work mostly right most of the time, right? And intervening in a more minor way. And that's a very dramatic shift. So I think that's the leading edge of where things are really working well. And again, it's not exactly uniform. It's always this jagged frontier, right? So if you're working in a slightly niche language or in a slightly niche area, then you're not going to get the same performance as like the modal, the most common types of use cases in frameworks and developers. But for sure, LLM assisted coding is right at the front of something that's working extremely well. And you see all these breakthroughs in open problems in mathematics being solved, right? You've got theoretical physicists saying this is a really interesting tool for us. It's coming up with new ideas and those kinds of things. So I think a lot of progress on the hard frontier of hard science. And then at the same time, you get the stuff that's a little bit more subjective, a little more qualitative, but that's a bit more everyday for folks, right? And you kind of say, is the latest GPT model really better than the previous one at writing my email for me? You go, that's a question of taste a lot of the time, right? And it's much harder to hill climb or make steady progress on taste. And because there's such ubiquitous adoption of these tools, you also kind of get fed up with the same tone of writing everywhere, right? And it's not that AI writing style is bad per se, but if all of a sudden 70 or 80% of all writing is produced in the same style, it gets pretty nauseating pretty quickly. So I think you have this very dramatic pendulum swing where people obsess over particular phrases or grammatical quirks or things like that show up in AI writing that they then react to in a negative way. But the pendulum swing one way to another is just going so incredibly quickly, right? And I would say the sort of snarky take maybe a few months ago was the biggest impact of AI is 10xing the output of the dumbest person where you were, which had an element of truth to a lot of people producing this sort of like work slop, just producing a lot of nonsense. But at the same time, I've also seen people who maybe were very capable, very intelligent, very clever, but struggle to maybe do effective written communication, get much, much better at it because they use their favorite coding agent as a sparring partner, or whatever kind of agent as a sparring partner, and just tease it out, and it's helping poke at the things that they're saying that are maybe clear in their head but come out really ambiguous when you say it, or just cleaning up things. So I think it's really hard to draw a hard distinction in terms of what's working and what's not and where the gaps in capability are. I think if you look at spend, it's very clear, like all of enterprise spend is on coding agents. So that is a very clear indication of where people see immediate value right now. But I think it's really hard to pin down things that aren't working. And what I find a lot, and I encounter a lot, is people telling me, oh, models can't do this or LLMs can't do that, based on something that they tried with ChatGPT 18 months ago and didn't work. And I'm sorry, but that is a badly out-of-date opinion at this point, right? And anything you tried even a couple of months ago is worth having another go at it. It's a very jagged frontier, and it's moving very quickly.
That's a very useful framing, or giving a good indication. Also, the budgets you mentioned, maybe how much did you spend and what do you actually get? And there's another word floating around and very hyped, agents, and gets thrown around everywhere. Everyone is using it. Can you say in plain terms, what is the actual difference between generative AI and agentic AI? Or where do they overlap, enable each other?
Yeah.
And why does it matter that AI is actually starting to do things rather than just answering things? It's like acting on your behalf.
Good question. There's agentic in the sense of agency, right? The ability to take actions. And that's really not a new thing that came with generative AI, right? Of course, lots of people were building voice and chat agents or representatives that were integrated with backend systems, doing customer support and fetching data from an API and doing something. So the fact of retrieving real information and acting in the real world and having some impact, that's not particularly new, but it is obviously exciting, right? It's a lot more exciting than just like chatting with ChatGPT. If you actually talk to something and things change in the real world or things get done for you, that's obviously very exciting. So that's one aspect of it, is the ability to take real action. Another is whether you give it agency in the sense of you give it the ability to make decisions, right? Or reason about what it should be doing quite autonomously, right? As opposed to prescribing beforehand, here's exactly how we want to handle a refund for this customer, giving the LLM the opportunity to say, here's what we know about this customer, here's what they just bought, come up with something reasonable, right? That's another level of agency. But back to generative AI, I'm old enough to remember when we talked about discriminative and generative models in machine learning, and generative models had nothing to do with language models per se. It just meant that you could take a sample from something. And I really like, actually, it's from a couple of years ago now, but there's a very sort of plain English definition of generative AI versus discriminative AI from Bennett Evans. And he says, discriminative AI is like pattern matching, right? So give me a bunch of photos and I'll tell you which ones have a dog in them or which ones are a hot dog or that kind of thing. And generative AI kind of flips it the other way around. Think of a hot dog and then come up with things that match that pattern, right? So it turns the thing on its head. And of course, all of these things are terribly interrelated. But right now, of course, when we think of generative AI, we think of a system that has at its core a large language model that is producing text. And around that is a harness or some kind of system that is providing it with some additional capabilities and tools to retrieve data, take action, those kinds of things, and to wrapping that all up in a product that somebody can use.
I like what you said as the definition of generative AI versus discriminative, because I think that's one of the misconceptions that still exists today for most people. Like AI equals generative AI because that's the thing that's been most talked about.
Yeah.
I have a funny story where actually I was at the Border Patrol in the US and they asked me, what is your profession? I'm in AI, this is my position, this is what I do. And the guy at the Border Patrol was like, that's impossible. AI's only been around for 2-3 years. How can you have such a high role in this kind of world? And at your age, I'm like, let me tell you, it's been around since a lot earlier than you probably think.
Yeah.
So what's your take on that? Because I think the definition definitely holds true. Discriminative AI is definitely specifically pattern recognition, and generative flips it on its script.
Yeah.
But what are other misconceptions that you feel that people still get wrong about what the technology is, what it's good at, and what it's not good at?
I declared bankruptcy a long time ago on like what the right terminology for things are, right? As someone who worked on what used to be called chatbots and then sometimes got called intelligent virtual agents and then enterprise virtual agents and then agentic AI or AI agents or all these kinds of things, you will never get consensus on what things mean, and people can call it whatever they please. I'm not particularly fussed about that. What do people get wrong is a very interesting question. I think one of the challenges with where we are is that we have a nascent general purpose technology that we don't yet know how to use. And we can use it in the things that it looks like it's good at. And so I think about Excel. It's a great example. It's a general purpose technology. And if you showed Excel to somebody in the 80s, if you showed it to an accountant, they'd be like, wow, this is cool. This does my job faster and better. Actually, I'm worried now. Maybe I don't have a job anymore. Maybe we only need one accountant for this whole Fortune 500 and they can just do everything because it's so efficient now. Of course, that's not how things played out, right? In fact, the role of what an accountant does and the type of things we can do and project and evaluate has completely changed. So they just do more things, even though the one specific task became a lot easier. But if you looked in the 80s and you showed Excel to a lawyer or somebody in marketing or somebody in HR or somebody in operations, none of them would think that had any relevance to their role. And yet Excel is the lingua franca of knowledge work, and it's how everybody organizes information and collaborates and works with data. And it's very difficult to predict what shape that's going to take. So right now we have software engineers whose job is to produce something that looks like text, and they use it very effectively to produce text that they could verify whether that text was correct or incorrect. And they're very productive and they're doing great things. And everybody else kind of scratching their head trying to figure out, how am I going to use this thing? How is this going to fit into my life and into my work? And I think that's something that emerges organically. We'd all like to have a crystal ball and look ahead and say, oh, this is going to be the killer app, right? But similarly, if you looked at the iPhone launch and said, oh, this is going to be really bad for the taxi industry, people would look at you like there was something wrong with you. It's quite elite. It's very difficult to know how these things will manifest themselves, and it's very easy to be snarky and dismissive because you tried one thing and it didn't work, or you tried to use it to produce some text and the text was really mid, and you thought, okay, I'm just writing this whole thing off because it produced some awful cliches. It is at a stage in development where the early adopters and the enthusiasts and folks who are really passionate about it are delivering great things, and we haven't yet figured out the product experience that makes this a mass consumer adoption type of event.
I think it was interesting what you called out there that you don't want to be snarky about technology, because I don't think any organization or even people want to turn out to be BlackBerry or Nokia, which had a similar kind of moment happen to them. Oh, nobody's going to want a phone that doesn't have any buttons, up until what you mentioned earlier, the iPhone came around and showed a completely different path.
Yeah.
That literally changed the whole thing. I think for me, generative AI in itself started to create that advent in terms of how we see technology moving towards a place where there's more action it can take on its own versus where we used to have to always be involved to configure and describe what the actions need to be. And that's what, for me, it feels like the big difference between just generative AI technology and then actually agentic being able to have that capability to decide on its own what the next actions are that it's going to take. But that brings with it a whole myriad of things that people are going to have to take into account. But I think if you have just coding developers working with these technologies, I've seen a lot of stories where they literally have to start thinking differently about what software development is, because you're no longer building the code. You're instructing a team of agents of what they have to build it, how they have to build it.
Yeah.
So I think that's a massive difference.
Definitely. I was part of a series recently called Show Us Your Skills, or Show Us Your Bracket Agent Skills, right? And this idea that you can build reusable skills or functionality, and they're just little documents, little text documents that describe how to achieve a particular task, and you can share them with your friends, and you can install them in your local environment so that your Claude or ChatGPT or whatever knows how to do a particular thing in the way that you like it. And it was this series where a friend of mine, Hugo, just invited a bunch of people who have developed large software projects, myself included, but a bunch of other people that I really sort of admire and respect. And it was just showing, how are you using this stuff? What are you doing that's creative? And I thought I was at the frontier of a lot of this stuff. And I watched this, and I watched the other episodes, and I realized that I'm a little baby. Well, you see some folks doing, it's incredible, right? Some of these systems where, somebody's off working with 5 agents running in parallel, but every single change it makes, it commits, and then in the background, there's another agent that goes and reviews the code in real time. And so that everything's been reviewed 3 or 4 times by the time it goes up for any kind of human review. And all this stuff, again, is we're in the exploration phase, not in the consolidation phase. And so all the cool ideas are being explored by lots of creative and interesting people. And which things really work and get consolidated, we will see. But the other interesting thing is that because the model capabilities keep advancing so quickly, a lot of things that we feel might be a really useful leg up now actually become pointless or no longer needed when the next sort of generation of ability shows up. But things like working creatively towards a goal, I think that's a concept that a year ago would have seemed unrealistic. Working with a coding agent, you would have said, hey, look, I have a very specific change, and if I can describe a very specific change, and I have all the context of the code base that's there, and it's local, that it can write correct code from the right. But now you can say, hey, here's a screenshot of the bug. go and fix it, right? And 30 minutes later, you come back and it's found a way to like debug it and understand what it was that was going on and tested it in a few different browsers for you and all these crazy things. So it's really, we're really at that phase where we don't yet know where the dust is going to settle on.
Yeah. So actually already given a very good example where agents have their place when they are a good fit, because also in my opinion, they are very best or good suited for those complex tasks with a lot of variation, where it requires flexibility, like in conversations, for example, because you can never predict how a conversation is evolving. So, and you said it's good for those cases where you actually just throw something at them. You know, it's going to be a complex problem-solving, process, but you will figure it out because you have this flexibility, or the agent has some flexibility. So, but there is still cases where it's actually better to use a simple tool, let's say, or more rule-based. Can you make this distinction for the audience? Like, where is it, like, if you would have to give it a definition, like this is a good task for an agent and this is a good task for a very prescriptive or a descriptive rule-based system?
Yeah.
Be a mix, or where does it?
Yeah. I think that's where everybody's playing right now, is figuring out where to dial up the autonomy and where to dial up the control, and what are the right set of Lego bricks, or what are the right set of primitive concepts we need to compose together to build these systems in a way that works. Because, of course, it's very frustrating when these things all of a sudden get flaky and they have these moments of brilliance, but then 1 in 5 times that you run it, it just skips something important, and that's obviously very frustrating. So I think for sure compliance and regulation is a very strong point, where it's not negotiable or optional whether you do something correctly or not. And so, of course, in regulated industries, you might have steps that you really want to enforce because you're actually legally obligated to do so. And just to give you a sense of the difference between regulation and business preferences, I remember in the very early days of ChatGPT, before we had harnesses, or this was really GPT 3.5 era, talking to some insurance companies who were like just rolling this out as their customer service chatbot. And I thought, that's insane. You're like, what are you talking about? And they said, yeah, but we're just quantifying risk. That's what we do as a business. And so long as the chance of doing something really bad is smaller than it is with a human, then it's obviously a benefit for us. Now, of course, if you're a regulated like mega bank, it's a different story. Nobody wants to be on the front page of the Wall Street Journal for the wrong reason, or be the first to get hit with a huge lawsuit or something like that. But I think the way that people think about risk and assess risk is really changing. And I feel that the first 1.5 or 2 years post ChatGPT, people felt comfortable just coming up with excuses why they didn't need to act and give themselves an out because there were hallucinations. There were all these concerns that people had about what it could do or what it could not do. But the patience is really run out to do something now, right? So in rapid progression now, I've had a front row seat to this for the last few years of very conservative enterprises who used to just spend all their time figuring out how to make the worst case scenario as okay as possible, now going really gung-ho because, as Sundar from Google said, the risk of underinvesting is much bigger than the risk of overinvesting. That's the point of view. The point of view is this wave is so big that actually the regular rules of business kind of go out the window a little bit, right? There's really a sense that there's an urgency to act, and maybe we'll clean up along the way. So I think that's a bit of macro context to just the attitude that people have. Now, if you're building something at a meaningful amount of scale, then there's obviously an argument for imposing a bit more structure than just providing instructions written by humans, maybe many humans in many different departments that become part of some larger application, and you just kind of make a smoothie of all these prompts and throw it to the LLM at a given point in time and just hope that it does the right thing. So there's some sense in which you need to navigate that as an organization. Where do we want to impose structure? Either because we need it for regulatory reasons, or because we need this in order to be not building on quicksand, but building on solid foundations that we can add more capabilities over time. So, of course, it's trivially true that if you already know how a business process works, you don't get any brownie points for laundering that through an LLM and getting the LLM to follow it, right? So if you've already written this down, you know how it's going to go. The question is, of course, how do you pair that with an LLM in a way that, as we talked about before the podcast started, in a way that lets the LLM work its magic, right? And I think there we're seeing also a reversal and an evolution in the architectures where there was an awful lot of engineering for a long time around, okay, I'm going to build a very strict sort of workflow around how this process runs, and I'm going to use the LLMs to sprinkle a little fairy dust on top, do a little bit of processing, rephrasing, information extraction, that kind of thing. I'm seeing increasingly a reversal in that, where you're saying, actually, there has been so much progress in the capability of the LLMs to solve problems, and they're so capable of connecting the dots between different things and handling edge cases, that actually we should start with that as a layer, and then we're going to instead add the determinism and the control on top of that as an additional layer. And so that's a very interesting reversal I've seen in the last sort of 12 to 18 months. And that's really only possible because the rate of progress in the models is so high, right? And so it's very difficult for anybody, and I just don't see this right now the way that we used to a few years ago. It's very difficult for any enterprise to say, this is our architecture. This is how we're going to do it. We're going to consolidate on this. This is how it's going to work for the next 4 or 5 years. Everyone is quite rightly hedging their bets. And they're saying, we're going to do a little bit of this and a little bit of that. We're going to duct tape it all together and see which bits are working and invest more in some and deprecate some others, because it's too dynamic. It's too much of a moving target to rationally say, this is the right answer. Here's how we're going to do it.
Yeah, I think that's absolutely true, because if you look at the way that organizations have been testing and trying to figure out, okay, what actually works, what doesn't work. And there's a couple of interesting examples of what you were talking about earlier before, that you don't want to just give free rein for these models to be able to go about. I think I read an example from McDonald's not too long ago where they'd actually implemented a chatbot, or basically put an element to their app to help people decide what they want to order. But they didn't put the right guardrails around it so people could actually just use it to write code. So that was interesting that all of a sudden they saw their bill rack up massively because people started to see that this is a free entry into this type of technology. But throughout what you were talking about, I really felt like you're a strong advocate for having governance, control, structure, and at least a level of design behind how you're going to go about building these types of applications or building for the future as an organization. And I've heard you mention the word hardness a couple of times as well. So would you mind just maybe talk about what is a hardness in the context of what we're discussing today? And why does it matter so much to you that there is a design behind AI acting on its own? Because it does feel like you put a lot of value on that specifically.
Definitely. So a harness, well, maybe a good way to explain what a harness is to counter, I think, a common objection to LLMs, where, again, to the point of people being snarky, people love to make the point, it's just predicting the next word, which in some mechanical sense, maybe there's some element of truth to it, but it's not at all a helpful way of thinking about how to work with these systems. And of course, nobody who's interacting with an LLM or with ChatGPT or Claude or Gemini or something similar is interacting with a raw language model, right? First, there's the raw language model. Then there's the training on top of it that actually tells it to follow instructions as opposed to just literally predicting the next word. And then, of course, there's the product around it, which is saying, hey, you have the ability to retrieve data from these places, to browse the web, to write files, to take these actions, all of this kind of stuff. And so this is all traditional software that is sitting around.
It's plumbing.
It's plumbing, yeah. And it's giving that text-producing machine the ability to take structured actions and say, okay, I have these capabilities available to me. I'm going to invoke them. And you know what? I don't need to discover from scratch right now how to fetch a web page. In fact, somebody has written code for me to fetch a web page, and I can just invoke it and tell it which web page I would like. And you can take that as far as you like, right? In a particular industry, you might say, okay, we have an internal site or intranet or something like that, or document store where the documents are all in a particular format. And actually, there's a little pre-processing step that, because these are giant XML documents, and there's thousands and thousands of lines in them that we don't need. Right, so actually we have a specific flavor of this fetching a web page tool that strips out all the crap we don't need. And so you can customize, you can make it as specific to your use case as you want, and that sort of sends you down the path of creating a custom coding harness, but also augmenting more and more the shortcuts that you offer your agent or your model or whatever you want to call it to do the things that you do frequently, right? And I think the shape that those shortcuts take, it keeps evolving. And I think we haven't quite found what is the right level of granularity, right? Is it a tool, which is a very atomic thing, right? Think of it as like an API call, right? Go and fetch the list of, I don't know, people in my organization, right? That's a very sort of atomic little piece. Is it something more like a skill that says, hey, here's how to organize an after-work drinks event, right? And that tool call might be one part of it, right? But there's sort of a general script, right? Or is it something more macro? And I think these all have trade-offs because the more specific things you encode in the tools, the less general purpose they are. And there's another line of thinking that says, actually, you should just let the model write its tool on the fly, right? They're great at generating code. So let it generate the code for the tools. So again, we're really in exploration mode. But the concept of a harness, I think, is a pretty robust one that you will always, it's silly to just produce everything from first principles in response to every single user input. And I think this question that we're navigating of control and determinism and predefined logic is just a question of where do you start on day one of a project and where does it evolve? And on day one of a project, it is magical. It is truly magical that you can just tell your model, here's what I want you to do. And it will do a pretty good job. And it will be 80% right. And then you can go and finesse afterwards. And of course, as you go and say, hey, look, we don't want to do this for one user for one use case. But actually, this needs to be personalized and usable for every user and every possible state or context that they can be in for thousands of different use cases across our enterprise. What is the right level of structure? What's the substrate that we can build upon?
That actually leads me to my next question, because you also already mentioned that a lot of organizations are shifted from being a little bit more cautious with these things to, okay, now we just have, or we actually really have to do something with LLMs in particular. And then you also just mentioned the first version maybe or the prototypes or the demos, they do a pretty good job. They look super cool, but then you said it yourself, it's a lot of fine tuning maybe in the end. So why do you think that is, that first, or why lots of demos look first super impressive, and then when they get into production, actually thrown in the real world, they fall apart?
Yeah. I think the falling apart, the point where they're falling apart is moving further and further to the right in the drag. But to answer your first question, why does it feel so different? For those of us who've been building software for a long time, you have a cool idea for a new project. Great. The first week you start building auth, and then you build a backend, and then you have an API, and then you build a really crappy UI on top of it, and then you keep iterating, and then you have your MVP, which really isn't viable yet because it just has the most rudimentary bits of functionality. And you're trying to get excited about it. And of course, when you're building with Gen AI, you have all the dopamine in the first 10 minutes. Because you just describe the thing that you want, and there you go, right? And so, for example, I have a presentation later today for a large enterprise, and it's their partner day. And I wanted to use some interactive polling and stuff for my presentation. And there's a well-known tool for doing this, but I didn't like it. It was ugly, it was clunky, and they were probably going to try and upsell me to something that I didn't want to buy. I said, Claude, build me a custom one, like on the train on the way down, and it's better, and I like it. And it's fingers crossed it goes well today, but I haven't been able to test it with an audience of a couple hundred people, but let's see. So I'll come back and I will tell you whether that one fell on its face or whether that absolutely purely vibe-coded experience, does the trick. So again, there's always a frontier that I think is difficult to anticipate, especially if you're not at the coalface of building software and you're not there, and you're not the one responsible for maintaining a large production code base. There's always a frontier where things start to creak and break. But it's very difficult to combat that experience of building something magical in a few minutes by wagging your finger and say, oh yeah, but someday we're going to have to maintain this thing, right? So I think that's something for every organization to navigate and think about, and also appreciate that the frontier just keeps shifting.
I just wanted to go a little bit deeper on one thing that you just said at the end there, which is it's kind of hard to not go back to or skip over the fact that you have that level of dopamine. This just worked and I created this new thing, and then start thinking about, yes, we are going to have to maintain this in a couple of months, years, or maybe even days, depending on what it is that you're building. And this is something interesting that I kind of see evolving as well right now, where a lot of organizations are going through that process. They are testing it. They're building something themselves, where typically you would go out on the market and buy. But that is like becoming, in my perspective, the trial, where you used to go to multiple vendors, you trialed something, saw which one was best fit. Now I feel like organizations are building the tool that they need themselves, and oftentimes, especially driven by cost, realize after 6 months, a year, oh, actually, now we have to get in touch with permissions. A lot of the scaffolding that you were talking about earlier, these are the more really sexy things that have to get done to be able to scale this up. And it feels like that kind of has flipped on its head a little bit, where people are now, they're building what they need. They don't have all the scaffolding, but they get to a point where they do need it. And then they're like, okay, now we know exactly what we want and need. Well, let's go find it out on the market. Is that, because you guys build software just like we do, is that something that you're seeing as well that you can relate to? Or are you like...
No, 100%. The enterprise software buying cycle has fundamentally changed in the last 18 months. There's no doubt about that. As you say, the first step is, can we vibe code this?
Yeah.
You two, spend a weekend. Tell us what you come up with. And is it viable? Is it plausible? Is it better? Because, again, you always have this build first buy discussion. And when you buy something from a vendor, is it going to be exactly what we want, or is it 80% what we want, and we have to implement some clunky workarounds, right? What is the frontier, and what is the thing that we strategically want to own? And I think that's something that every organization is navigating right now. Is, of course, generative AI is like a C-level strategic priority for the business. Great, let's start there. Okay, which parts of that do we want to own? We're not going to trade foundation models that's easy to eliminate purely because it costs too much, and we're not going to hire the experts. But then, okay, there's still going to be some software built around it. And that's why, again, I see all this sort of hedging of bets of people saying, actually, we'll bring in multiple vendors to do things that significantly overlap, and we'll also build something ourselves. I've even seen organizations where the multiple teams are competing and they can't agree on an architecture, so they ship both and just run them both in parallel for a couple of years and just see which one pans out and see which one works out. So there's an awful lot of inefficiency as everybody tries to navigate this and figure out which are the parts of this that are truly ours and our IP that we want to own, right? And where are things where we prefer to work with a vendor because it's going to decrease our total cost of ownership or just make us faster overall. Or I think the burden on anyone who's a software vendor today is not to convince your prospective customer that you'll have this amazing software with this amazing IP that no one else can replicate, and you fools, you could never be clever enough to build what we build, because people rightly believe that they can build anything now. But it's to show that you're a partner who can innovate and will stay at the frontier of what's possible over the course of multiple years. And you're that partner who provides, again, a substrate that they can add their magic and their IP on top of, as opposed to a fixed point solution that works the same way for 5 years and then there's a big V2 and then they have to migrate to the V2, right? I think the burden is on proving that you are and will continue to be innovating, and that you're really at the leading edge of what your market segment does.
Yeah, let's actually bring it home for the listeners who are trying maybe at the moment to figure out their AI strategy, no matter if they're business owners or team leads or someone that's trying to make a case internally that we discussed, like with making a pilot. So what would be your advice for them? How can they cut through the noise? Because if they're not building the prototype or the MVP themselves, how can they decide what to do next with AI technology, basically? Or what should they be looking at?
Yeah. I think in every industry, when general purpose technology becomes available, the first step is take this thing and let's just figure out how to do what we're already doing, but do it more efficiently. And then there's a second phase where you see that your industry fundamentally changes in some meaningful way, right? And we talked about iPhones and Ubers before, right? And of course, disintermediating taxis and all that kind of stuff is a very big dramatic shift, and it changes who holds power and who creates value and who captures value in an industry. And so everybody's right now nervously trying to guess What's that going to be in our business? But you don't get to be a player in that phase 2 unless you do a really good job with phase 1. And you build the muscle, and you build the trust, and you build the data, and you build the internal ability to execute. And in this case, of course, it's AI. Maybe in the past it was Excel, right? But now it's AI that we get to be excited about. And so you have to go and build these things within your existing paradigm and build up the expertise so that you can see, because you can only see the future when you're at the sharp end of what's working and what's not working. And so I would very much encourage everybody to be builders and keep building on top of things and look very critically at everything people are pitching you, because it's really hard for you or for a vendor to know if any particular software detail has staying power, right? I think it's discrediting if you claim to know for sure that something does. So it's really an obligation that I think every company has to go and build and explore and embrace the inefficiency. You are not building the final version of anything right now, but the cost of sitting it out is very high. So you don't get to sit it out. You just get involved, get stuck in, and start building.
Yeah, I think we've heard that quite a few times, where indeed the cost of trying to sit this out and not joining the wave is going to be indeed much more expensive. And I think even though, just from the aspect of governance that we also touched on a few times, the requirements that are going to arise, even for tools that you are already using today that also fall into the category of AI, that people simply are not considering because it's more on the discriminative side, which for some reason oftentimes gets classified as not AI, even though it is, are also going to fall into certain categories that have fines, penalties, and everything else that comes with all of the governance. Now, as you were talking throughout the episode, you said a lot of times it's really hard to predict where things are, and people should try and experiment, find out what works, what doesn't work. But yet, I'm going to ask you to bring out the crystal ball and basically give us your perspective of, okay, what is the thing that you are most excited about, that you see coming in the distance when it comes to artificial intelligence? So basically how, in general, technology is going to keep on evolving at this incredibly rapid pace.
Yeah. So I'm a subscriber to the thesis that everything that can be code will be code. And so many things that we don't think of as being implemented through code or being defined in code will become so, purely because it is so efficient and effective to have an AI agent manipulate and edit it for you, that I think tools like PowerPoint, I think slides will be defined in code. And I think non-technical teams will be working on slide decks that are defined in code because they'll be using their coding agent to make changes. And rather than figuring out how to align some boxes and make the copy better, they'll do that to their coding agent. Because the amazing thing when you're working in that way is that you have a partner that you're working with that is not just the expert on here's how I make slides look nice, but they also have the context of the conversation of the story that you're trying to tell. And so you're simultaneously working on the copy, on the layout, on the overall storyline, as well as on the actual layout and the visuals and everything else. So that's something I very much subscribe to. I've been working on some videos for social media in the last few months. I've never touched a video editor. It's all defined through code. It's all through a coding agent. It's fantastic. I've never learned how to use a video editor, and I never intend to either, because that sort of single channel of context is so important and so powerful. And the other piece that I'm really excited about is finding new ways to give your agent the ability to inspect its own work and to validate its own work. And of course, that's where we see the most progress in AI, is in all the fields where we can verify sort of truth, right? And it started with games and chess and Go and some video games and Atari and all this stuff with DeepMind a few years ago. But all these places where you can objectively say you did it well or you didn't do it well, right? So other ways that you can give these models the ability to inspect whether they achieved the intended outcome and to sort of self-critique, right, against what it is that you were asking for, that just massively shortcuts the iteration cycle and moves it to the inner loop of your agent like doing stuff for you and coming back and telling you, hey, here's the next version, versus always having a human in the loop, right? So how do we make that human in the loop review as rare as possible is, I guess, another direction that I'm interested in.
I really like what you said at the start there of your crystal ball moment, where that single stream of context that actually involves everything, design, the actual story that you're trying to tell, how that comes out into the video, for example, that you were working on. If I were to translate that into actually consolidation of what typically now are experts' roles, right? You got the designer, you have the video editor, you have the person that's creating the story. Do you see the future where more and more people's now individual roles are going to merge into, like they are already with coding? Everybody's becoming a builder, which is scaffolding, it's infrastructure, it is the design, it is all of those components that typically are front end, back end, etc. Now they're just builders. They're going to build end to end. You see that happening in the broader sense of across the organization.
I think we're seeing it in marketing, where there's a big shift in marketing to hiring generalists who can own an audience and own a vertical slice. And your job is to get this audience excited about what we're doing. And that means everything from generating ideas to the campaign to executing on it, where you would have all these specialized roles, as you say, of the person who does performance marketing and the graphic designer and the person who's maybe doing more of the copywriting kind of things, all collapsing because actually the execution is at a point that someone who isn't particularly skilled, like I am at visuals, can do something pretty decent, right? Good enough. And so, again, it moves from purely being a thing that only requires craft to being something that requires a mix of a lot of craft and an awful lot of judgment. And judgment is a thing that you hone and develop through feedback with the audience that you care about. So I think that's a place that we're seeing it very quickly being adopted.
It's very interesting. So thank you, Alan, for being our guest.
Good. I'm glad it was interesting.
Very interesting.
Absolutely. Thank you so much for joining us.
Cool. Well, thanks for having me on.